Good evening, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Everything's working. Good job. All right. I'm so happy that tonight that I get to introduce Farah Godrej. We've been putting this talk together for a little while. We had some administrative difficulties making it happen and so on. So it feels like this one's been a little time coming, but I'm so glad we've got it. Tonight, Farah is going to be discussing her book, Freedom Inside, Yoga and Meditation in the Carceral State. Let me start with the official biography first. So Farah is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Riverside, and her areas of research and teaching include Indian political thought, Gandhi's political thought, cosmopolitanism, globalization, and comparative political theory. She also studies contemporary issues such as environmental justice, food politics, and mass incarceration. Her research has appeared in multiple journals, and she's also the author of Cosmopolitan Political Thought, Method, Practice, and Discipline. But her new book offers a combination of personal narrative and scholarly research in order to examine the role of yoga and meditation, specifically in US prisons. And that it offers a glimpse inside the system that we often call mass incarceration, which disproportionately punishes, confines, and controls those from Black, brown, and poor communities, and asks itself, how do self-disciplinary practices such as yoga and meditation work when they are taught inside unjust systems? Now, I don't want to say a lot more about it because otherwise that would kind of tell you about Farah's talk before she talks, but I just want to add that to my knowledge, programs of carceral yoga like this exist in so many countries worldwide now, and beyond those specific entanglements of what is known as kind of prison yoga with US racial and class politics, there are such important questions that I think we need to start asking ourselves about yoga's use as a tool of discipline and conformity in any jurisdiction. And these are such vital questions. I'm so glad that we get to have this discussion, this talk today. With no more delay then, I'm just going to hand over to Farah. Welcome.
Thank you, Theo and Erica, for that very generous introduction. I assume everyone can hear me okay? Excellent, very good. I will just say before I begin that my AirPods headphones sometimes do something funky. So if for any reason my sound suddenly goes off, or you stop hearing me, or something strange happens, I encourage you to just interrupt at will and just jump right in and say, hey, we can't hear you, or whatever it is. So, all right. So without further ado then, again, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be invited here and to be among so many of you. So great to see so many of you here. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity today to talk about my forthcoming book. And so with that, I will share my screen. Okay, I assume everything is working. Screen share is good. Very good. Thank you. So the title of my talk, as you know, is the same as the title of my book, which is Freedom Inside, ? And we'll talk soon about that question mark in the title. Yoga and Meditation in the Carceral State. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the book project and summarize for you what I'm trying to do in this book. This is a book that has taken up the better part of the last 5 or so years of my life, that has really involved my being completely immersed in a whole different world. It is also not a book that is going to give us any firm answers. I like to tell my students that if they leave my classroom with more questions than answers, then I've done my job. And I would say that the book is also like that, in that it's more about raising questions, problematizing, asking how people interpret and make meaning of the world around them, rather than about giving any definitive answers. I also want to say that I have made a very deliberate and intentional decision to write this book in a way that is broadly accessible beyond just an audience of fellow academics. And this has really been an ethical decision in order to ensure that the ideas and findings in this book really resonate with the very people that I worked with and spent time with, namely people who are impacted by the prison system. So in that sense, what you hear today may not sound entirely like the kind of work you might be expecting from someone with my academic history and training, but that I want to say that that is by design. Okay, so before I jump right into talking about the book, I would like to begin with a story about 2 different people I interviewed, both of whom had served time in prison. The first person is a guy named Lee, who was in his early 40s and had served over 22 years. And like most others who have done time, Lee describes a difficult childhood that was marked by poverty and addiction, trauma and abuse and discrimination. He was isolated, he felt outcasted, and at the age of 15, he joined a gang, and by the age of 17, he was incarcerated. Lee describes his transformation in prison, and he attributes it to his meditation practice. He says, as I got more involved with Buddhism and meditation, I realized I created my own suffering. And I just want to make sure here that the slides are moving okay. You're seeing the slide, that things move on the slide. Very good, thank you. So to continue quoting Lee, he says, it's a choice I made that led to all the suffering within myself. I was not accepting responsibility for my poor choices. I was blaming everybody for my suffering, but I had to blame myself. It all comes down to the choices that you make in life. That's what I got out of studying Buddhist philosophy and meditation. The whole 22 years and 6 months, I deserve it and accept it because I used that time wisely to better myself. Now, I want to quote from another person I interviewed named Dylan. Dylan is in his late 20s, or certainly was at the time that I spoke with him. He also grew up severely disadvantaged in the foster care system. He bounced in and out of group homes and schools and special education institutions. He began using drugs to cope and eventually served 5 years on substance abuse related charges. Now, Dylan, in our conversation, offered a very different interpretation of meditation, which he says was developed both during and after his incarceration. Here's what Dylan says. He says, meditation practice teaches us to see our conditioning. It taught me how to think and how to inquire, not just internally, but also externally. And he says, as a result, his practice not only transformed him personally, but also gave him a moral compass to critique an unjust world. Here's what he says. He says, this entire system of mass incarceration clearly causes suffering. Why do we have such long sentences? Why don't we give more leeway to folks who come from really rough backgrounds who didn't have a fighting chance to begin with? Where did I learn that it's okay to get a 10-year sentence for having a bag of cocaine? Now, Dylan, oh, I'm sorry, I should have. Okay, there we go. Dylan reports that his meditation practice also inspired nonviolent resistance. He says, I became much less fearful. I would just tell the officers, no, that's not fair. You don't have a right to do this. He says, I wasn't aggressive either. I was just like, no, you're not going to keep pushing me around. And then he says, the things that used to make me afraid no longer made me tremble in the same way. And as a result, he says he was sent to solitary confinement multiple times. But he says, I would rather go to the hole than compromise my beliefs. And the hole, as you can imagine, is slang for solitary confinement. So why am I giving you these two excerpts? Well, these contrasting perspectives present us with a paradox. In one case, meditative teachings seem to be interpreted as acceptance of one's external circumstances, and in the other, they cause the practitioner to inquire critically into the root of those circumstances. In one case, they seem to entail the belief that one's circumstances, including one's suffering, are self-created, and in the other, they inspire sharper and more critical examination of the systemic collective causes of suffering. And while one person, Lee, reports avoiding all forms of resistance in prison, Dylan credits his meditation practice with giving him the strength to occasionally undertake nonviolent resistance. So in the introduction to my book, I talk about how the contradictions between these two views really motivated my project. I start by telling readers about my own personal training in these various traditions, the principles of non-reactivity and non-attachment and non-judgment that I had been trained in, to know that life in the material world was transient and ultimately illusory, to see suffering as created by our own minds rather than by circumstances, and to work on accepting external circumstances as the route to releasing that inner suffering. Now, in yogic philosophy, we see some version of these ideas in texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras. these ideas of inward-oriented spiritual pursuit, right? This idea of doing one's duty with non-reactive acceptance, for those of us who may have, encountered the Bhagavad Gita, and also working to detach from fluctuating worldly circumstances. But we also see very similar ideas of detachment and acceptance in many, many schools of Buddhism. So the question that motivated this project was, well, what about collective suffering? Are we supposed to accept inequity and injustice as part of the fluctuation of life, or worse, as created by our own minds? Because surely injustice, which is caused by powerful political structures, exists as a cause of collective suffering in the world, no matter how our minds choose to view it. So what, if anything, can these traditions tell us about balancing non-reactivity and acceptance on the one hand with justified opposition to social and political oppression on the other hand? So these are the questions that led me inside prisons, to explore whether these practices could assist people, not just any people, but deeply vulnerable, deeply marginalized people, in dealing with systemic injustice. Now, why prisons? Why are prisons the focus of the study? Well, not everyone may consider this obvious, but the evidence, in my view, has long been considered incontestable that incarceration in the US, and it's important to note that my talk today and my book is very specifically centered around the US context. The evidence has long been incontestable, I believe, that mass incarceration in the US is a patently unjust and unequal system. That is a foundational premise of this book. The United States is often referred to as a carceral state. It polices and cages the world's largest prison population of over 2.3 million, while an additional 8 million are on other forms of supervision, such as parole or probation or deportation proceedings. So whether in absolute numbers or in percentage terms, the US holds more people in prisons and jails than any other country by a very long margin. More Americans are incarcerated today than those killed in all the wars in history combined in which the US has fought. 1 in 23 American adults are thought to be under some form of government control or supervision. And in addition to those staggering numbers of persons incarcerated, which, by the way, is at a rate 10 times higher than comparable democratic nations, of course, the most important thing to note is that the majority of those who are confined and controlled in such institutions are Black or brown and poor, for the most part. Those from poor communities and communities of color are incarcerated at exponentially higher rates than white populations, which automatically diminishes their life chances in all kinds of ways. We'll get to that in a bit. And the ripple effects of these policies are intergenerational. 113 million Americans have had an immediate family member incarcerated, and millions of children have had at least one parent in detention. And that compounds the effects of disadvantage through the separation and further impoverishment of these families. Then we have practices such as cash bail, free trial detention for those who are unable to post bail, and debtor's prison, which is the incarceration of those who are unable to pay monetary penalties. And all of this ensures that poorer populations are overrepresented in prisons, often without meaningful representation. 1/4 of Americans who are incarcerated have not been convicted of a crime and are being held in pretrial detention, usually simply due to the high cost of cash bail. And only 2% of incarcerated Americans, those in jails and prisons, have had trials, and the rest are routinely pressured into taking plea bargains through the threat of a longer sentence by a legal apparatus that systematically disadvantages defendants. So this vast network of entrenched interests that profit financially from imprisonment, and here we can talk about police and correctional officer unions and lobby groups, private prison companies, and businesses that supply goods and services to prisons for profit. This entire network has been described by the term that I think is now well known as the prison industrial complex, right? But these effects of incarceration do not end with being imprisoned. It's very important to note that. They extend far beyond imprisonment, and they follow people into their lives for years and years after they're released. Formerly incarcerated people are relegated to a second-class citizenship in the US by legalized discrimination in everything from housing to employment to social welfare benefits, which ends up making re-entry into society a virtually impossible task, and it all but guarantees a return to prison. And the political implications of this are even more stark. Many states either permanently or temporarily disenfranchise people who are serving time or have previously served time on felony convictions. So these rules that I'm referring to fundamentally alter the shape of American democracy because they create a permanent underclass left to what one scholar has called a civil death. They are deprived of basic necessities, livelihoods, and citizenship rights. And the result is a second-class citizenship for millions of, quote, disempowered and alienated people who occupy a subordinate position in the democratic community. And this is a quote from the excellent work of political scientists Amy Lehrman and Vesla Weaver, whose book Arresting Citizenship I highly recommend. So I became increasingly aware of this biased, unequal system. And I also began to notice that many organizations were offering yoga and meditation programs inside prisons. But I started to wonder, how exactly were these practices being taught to the most vulnerable and marginalized among us? How do yoga and meditation enter into the prison context? And I began to wonder if yogic and meditative traditions might promote a kind of political passivity if they are taught as a palliative tool to accept and cope and comply with a miserably unjust existence. And they become, in that sense, a recipe for the continuation of unjust power structures. Now, why worry about this, right? Where do these worries come from? In the recent past, a whole slew of commentaries have emerged from scholars and practitioners who have started to express a great deal of concern about how these traditions are being taught in the West. Some of you may have heard the term McMindfulness, to which I would add McYoga. And these are, shorthand, kind of silly, facetious shorthand terms for capturing a much deeper problematic or concern, which is that people are overemphasizing the inward, private, individualized aspects of these teachings, which can encourage us to see all misfortune as largely of our own making, leading us then to ignore or downplay the systemic causes of social and political suffering. So several leading critics have asserted that meditation in the West has become a banal form of spirituality that avoids social and political transformation and instead reinforces the status quo. Where do these worries come from? Well, we see corporations and governments and militaries and other powerful institutions co-opting these practices as techniques for social control and pacification. We see mindfulness being taught to corporate employees for greater productivity and adaptation to stressful workplace conditions. But of course, no one wants to acknowledge the economic structures that create these stressful conditions in the first place. It is taught to students, yoga and meditation are taught to students in public schools to make them more calm, more disciplined. But of course, there is no critical inquiry into structures like race and class, which serve as the very source of their stress. And similar claims have been made about the yogic tradition, that it is now encouraging increasingly in its practitioners this view that everything, right, this ability to see everything in terms of one's private thoughts and behaviors, while tolerating discomfort in outer circumstances. So the concern is that these philosophies can end up supporting dominant or unjust political arrangements, even if unwittingly. Sorry, I forgot to update my slides. So these traditions and practices can end up as apologists for what is sometimes called neoliberalism, which is a worldview, and I can say more about this later, but I think of neoliberalism as a worldview which insists on individual choice and behavior as a catch-all solution, and consequently refuses to acknowledge that some structures are so entrenched and systemic that they require collective change and action. So neoliberalism takes the logic of the market and applies it to everything. And it teaches us that if individuals behave correctly, then collective issues will sort themselves out. And in turn, this kind of a view gives power structures the excuse for maintaining an unequal status quo, while putting the entire burden of change on individuals. Now, one concrete example of this is to look at the message that is often repeated that individuals should take responsibility for recycling and conserving water and consuming in a mindful way in order to save the environment. And this is an argument that completely obscures, right, and masks the role of governments and corporations, which use energy at exponentially higher rates than private individuals and wield far more systemic power, yet the public discourse assigns responsibility for the environment to individuals. So in the same way, there's a concern that these practices are causing everyone to look inward while ignoring these collective systemic issues. Now, these commentaries certainly struck a chord with me, but I knew that they did not capture the entire story. Because from personal experience, I knew that yoga and meditation practices could be transformative in ways that give people the tools to develop critical capacities and awareness of systemic collective suffering. They can allow us to cultivate a more expansive way of seeing the world. And as a student of Gandhi, I knew that an apolitical or passive approach to these traditions was incomplete. Because from Gandhi, I had discovered that being a practitioner of yoga or meditation was not exclusive with critique or activism. And in fact, for Gandhi, spiritual pursuit necessarily required contemplating injustice. And of course, not just contemplating it. For Gandhi, I would say yoga or meditation were tools to act politically, assertively and disruptively, yet non-violently, in response to injustice. And many modern interpreters of these traditions have echoed these ideas, and they have shown that acceptance does not need to equal passivity, and that techniques for internal calm and peace can in fact allow for productively acting upon justifiable anger. So the question that drives my book is, how do these complex forces work when self-disciplinary practices like yoga and meditation are taught inside an unjust system? Can they encourage incarcerated practitioners to internalize and comply with the logic that improving yourself is the only appropriate response to systemic injustice? Or can they prove disruptive to mass incarceration if incarcerated practitioners start to develop more nuanced forms of self-improvement, which include non-conformist critical responses that challenge the system's logic? So, in other words, to put it bluntly, can they encourage us to think in terms of not just me and how I can improve myself, but also combine that with thinking critically about how suffering is often caused collectively, systemically, and structurally? These are the questions that motivated me to undertake this inquiry. And they led me to take my own yoga and meditation practice inside prisons, to investigate how yoga and meditation were being taught to those who are punished and caged and controlled by this deeply unjust system. So how did all of this work? What are the methods? I'll just say something very briefly about that for now. Between August of 2016 and March of 2020, I volunteered with organizations offering yoga and meditation in local prisons and jails. And I learned about how their members were teaching these practices to incarcerated persons. So my goal was to learn about how yoga or meditation were being taught to people incarcerated at these institutions by doing the work myself. I worked to understand the missions and the leadership of these organizations. I attended their trainings, and I eventually was invited to take on a kind of a leadership role in several of these organizations. So I became very immersed in them. I learned about yoga and meditation practices, programs at different facilities, jails and prisons, and of course, their relationships with prison administrators. I found myself immersed in the logistical landscape of prison life, of course, to a very limited extent, where I did yoga and meditated with incarcerated students. I got to know many of them very well. I engaged them in conversation, and I learned how they interpreted the principles of yoga or meditation in the face of their own incarceration. Because of my involvement with these organizations and the connections that they created, I was granted the rare opportunity to conduct an officially sanctioned, that is to say, approved by the prison, an ethnography inside one particular facility. And meanwhile, my network of relationships allowed me to produce over 60 in-depth, semi-structured interviews with both prison volunteers and formerly incarcerated practitioners. So much of the book is based on the academic research that I conducted, but a lot of it is also based on my personal experiences of volunteer work, so that the book includes personal narrative, autobiography, and in one case, a collaboration and co-authored piece of writing with two of my then incarcerated yoga students. So that's the setup. What I want to do now in the time that I have remaining is to briefly highlight some of the research results and key findings in the main chapters. It's going to be very difficult in such a short period of time for me to fully describe a 300-page book that took 5 years to write. So today's talk is really more of a teaser or a trailer, and it's just going to scrape at the tip of the iceberg in terms of describing the complexities of what I found. So let's get right to it. What are some of the key findings? The first and really important thing to note is that prisons are places where inequality and subordination are taught, learned, and reproduced. The prison has an educational function, and that is to reinforce the second-class citizenship of many of its inhabitants. How does it do this? One of the most insidious things about the prison system, at least here in the US, is that it teaches the idea of individual responsibility despite well-documented disparities due to race or socioeconomic status. And it does this through self-help and psychology programs. Prisons and jails are replete with these programs. And to name just a few, we have substance abuse programs, anger management programs, and parenting classes, and of course, more recently, yoga and meditation programs, which come under the umbrella of these self-help and psychology programs in prisons. And all of these programs emphasize behavioral changes to make better choices and inculcate a sense of personal responsibility. So these rehabilitative programs indoctrinate people into repeating the message that their own flawed individual choices and lack of discipline are responsible for their incarceration. And any attempt to point to structural or systemic inequity, issues like race or poverty, is considered evidence of resistance to rehabilitation and can automatically lead to negative assessments by prison staff, which in turn affects a person's chances for early release or parole. So as a result, what do we find? We find that many incarcerated persons become amenable to the prison's psychological and therapeutic interventions. And they end up adopting the prison's view of themselves as diseased or flawed. And they end up recasting their own life story in a way that emphasizes their own moral blameworthiness. And for this reason, many scholars argue, and this is not just me, this is, much of the scholarship in criminology argues that these self-help and therapeutic programs in prisons function to keep the already excluded in their place. It is a social control mechanism, to put it bluntly, because people are treading water, right? Or on a hamster wheel, choose whichever analogy you like, because it's a cycle. They get sent to prison because they're already marginalized in the first place. Then they're set up to fail upon release because of all those forms of legalized exclusion that I described. All of this virtually guarantees their return to prison. And all the while they are learning, they're being taught to parrot the message of their own flaws. And they're being forced to deny the existence of systemic oppression. So there's a kind of relentless beating of the personal responsibility drum. And this can ensure that the populations that are cycling in and out of prisons are too weary or too beaten down to develop a political consciousness around race or class-based disadvantage, or to try to mobilize politically against these factors. So people can end up in a posture of what I call accommodation, where they are focused on accommodating, adapting, becoming more resilient, and just accepting the status quo and simply attempting to navigate it better, all the while facing down a system that is designed to ensure their repeated return to prison. It's a kind of compliance born of weariness. And here I want to quote from one of my interviewees, a woman named Sandra, and she says, "Some people end up saying, it is all my fault. There is nothing I can do about it. And they leave more disempowered than when they came in. They say, maybe I better just go along with it and be done with it. You just keep your head down." And in this way, they become what one scholar has called democratic pariahs, politically alienated and marginalized and disempowered and subordinated, because they keep being told by an entire system that everything is their own fault, even though we have mountains of research that shows us how completely the deck is stacked against these communities and populations. So why am I spending all the time talking about prisons? Well, this is the context into which yoga and meditation programs are entering. They are entering a context where an entire state-sponsored apparatus of pacification, control, and docility and compliance is at work. Yoga and meditation might seem apolitical and innocuous to many, but my goal in this book has been to show that this is far from the case, especially when they're taught in contexts like prisons, which are so politically shaped. Prisons are places where people are taught to internalize and accept their second-class status. And these rehabilitative programs inside these prisons are part and parcel of what the famous scholar of incarceration, Michelle Alexander, has called the genius of the current caste system. And of course, she's referring to what she calls the caste system in the United States. And the genius of the system, she says, is that incarceration appears avoidable through better choices and behaviors, and therefore voluntary, right? And this system depends for its legitimacy on the widespread belief that all of those who appear trapped at the bottom actually chose their fate. And this is a direct quote from her now seminal work, The New Jim Crow. So this is why I think we have good reason to be concerned about the co-optation of these practices like yoga and meditation. And we need to ask whether these practices of self-care can contribute to or reinforce these social control mechanisms. So what I want to do now is talk about 3 different chapters of my book where I explore this idea of exactly how yoga and meditation can be taught and received inside prisons. First, I'll talk about what I learned from my interviews with yoga and meditation practitioners who were formerly incarcerated. I conducted in-depth, semi-structured interviews with 25 people who were formerly incarcerated and had practiced yoga or meditation while inside prison. And here's a table that just shows you some very quick demographic information about my formerly incarcerated interviewees. I'll just leave that up very quickly for a few seconds, since we don't have too much time to dwell, but of course I'm happy to share these slides later or go back to them if anyone is interested. So some of the common themes that I saw among the people I interviewed: all of my respondents used yoga or meditation as a tool for coping with and surviving the harshness and chaos of the prison environment. Here's some direct quotes. They said things like, "It was a grounding experience in the turmoil. It really helped me calm my thoughts. It gave you a safe space to go. You could have a retreat and step away from the chaos around you." They talked about how it helped them to survive the dehumanization and isolation of incarceration. One person said, meditation gave me control of the levers of my sanity because I knew the environment was robbing me of my humanity. Another person said, I witnessed a lot of poor treatment, a complete disregard for the humanity in us. And I would do some breathing, some meditation, and it definitely provided some relief. And one woman said, she reports feeling like a human being again in her yoga classes, being human enough and valued enough to be offered this experience. And so, of course, I heard much from these respondents about, how it helped them slow down the mind and quiet the mind and sit with, right, the reality of their circumstances and process that reality in a healthy way. Now, beyond these commonalities, I found that my respondents' views could be categorized in two ways. I found that two kinds of narratives emerged from my interviews. The majority of my respondents offered one kind of narrative, what I'll call the first narrative. And this narrative was one of fully accepting personal responsibility for their own incarceration and seeing prison time as a time for individual self-transformation. So these stories largely converged around themes of personal defects and poor decision-making and having only oneself to blame and therefore oneself to improve, right? And yoga and meditation in this case seemed to solidify this perspective, used to reflect on bad choices, to hold oneself accountable, or to take responsibility for changing. And strikingly, this is very important. I really want to pause and make sure we let this sink in. Even those who insisted that their actions were not criminal, even those who insisted that their incarceration was not warranted, was not legitimate, all of these people enthusiastically endorsed the idea of transforming themselves through yoga or meditation. I'll give the example of Danny, one of my interviewees, who said, who first describes a very difficult life of poverty and racial disadvantage and refugee status. And, he talks about how he served 21 years for being involved in an attempted robbery in which neither he didn't discharge a weapon, nor did he injure anyone. He was offered a plea of 4 consecutive life sentences. And he and his co-defendants chose to go to trial. He describes a trial process that was riddled with procedural irregularity, conflicts of interest, allegations of misconduct by prosecutors, and all of this caused him to feel that his sentence was deeply unjust. But then he says, over time, his anger and resentment dissolved, and he said, I've come to accept my time. I deserve it because your own actions caused the karmic situation. I did the crime. I'm responsible for any consequences. And he identifies his meditation practice as a major factor in this change of perspective. He says, instead of trying to blame everything on the outside situation, I internalized it more. Like if someone is angry at me, well, what did I do to make him angry? That's really the teaching of the Buddha, right? Your mind is the creation of events or situations, whether good or bad. Or let's hear from Benjamin, an African-American man in his 50s who was extremely detailed in describing the injustice of his incarceration. He was very emphatic about how he was set up by the police and there was severe police misconduct involved in his case. And then he says, in the same conversation, practically the same breath, he says, if people would just look within instead of outwardly, I never thought the answer was within me. And now after studying meditation, I know it is. I have been transformed. Meditation has transformed me from before I went to prison to where I'm at today. It is night and day. Now, this is a really striking response because of all my respondents, Benjamin offers perhaps the most extensive critique of the injustice, not only of his own incarceration, but of the system as a whole. But he also says that meditation was a way for him to transform himself from the wrong direction he was taking. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I'm afraid I'm going to run short on time. So you'll find me kind of skipping ahead in the slides. So the second narrative that I found emerging in my interviews was a minority narrative, a kind of dissenting narrative. And it was a minority narrative in that, much fewer of my interviewees held this narrative, and it was a much more resistant narrative, right? The respondents in this group refused to accept the prison's narrative that they alone were responsible for their incarceration, and instead they pointed to flaws in social and political arrangements. And here's Sean, who was a Black man in his 50s who had spent almost 33 years incarcerated by the time I spoke to him. He says, how can the system not be held responsible for creating an environment that makes it almost implausible for an individual not to have contact with law enforcement and statistically wind up in jail or prison if you come from socially and economically depressed communities and you're a person of color? And then he says, I got caught in a mousetrap. It was set up to be like this. Whoops, sorry. I also want to quote again from Sandra, who is also a Black woman who details a life of poverty and homelessness and racism and abuse. And she served over 2 decades for accidentally killing her assailant while defending herself during a sexual assault. And she said, I definitely want to be accountable, but is the law telling me I should not have fought back? Should I have taken the bullet so that I'd be more believable? Where was the law when I was getting beaten, having cigarette burns on me, when I was raped, when I filed multiple restraining orders? And the one time I fight back, it's my fault? It just seems like more victim blaming. So in this group of respondents, we hear a kind of resistant narrative in which they say, you know, therapeutic incarceration is a myth. And Dylan, who you heard from earlier, says, in prison, personal responsibility is the language you're taught to use. I was drinking the Kool-Aid, and that was the indoctrination that we all got, right? You begin to internalize the idea that these programs are here to rehabilitate you. It's all your own fault if you're having a tough time. And for these respondents, yoga and meditation allowed for a more critical oppositional perspective. Emil, one of my very eloquent interviewees, said, it made me see more clearly. It made me understand the complexity and see incarceration as a systemic problem and realize that the system is messed up. All the programs encourage you to ignore the systemic level and think it's all my fault. Instead, my meditations shifted my viewpoint. They helped me understand what had happened to me because I had enough distance and could detach from the immediate feelings. So I'm really going to have to skip ahead because I now see that I'm running out of time. So I'll start to go a little faster, I guess. My interviewees pointed out how yoga or meditation could reinforce the passivity that prison logic teaches, the basic premises of acceptance of the moment and of your lot in life and everything being transient. This seems to reinforce the concept that we should just accept incarceration. And Dylan says, injustice is often not taught in yoga or meditation because there's sometimes a lot of subservience. It can be very pacifying, and maybe that's why it's promoted in prison. I initially rationalized my time as being the karmic fruit of my actions. And a concept like karma is reinforcing this fucked up society to normalize it. I want to skip ahead now to the next chapter in which I interviewed fellow volunteers who were also teaching yoga and meditation inside prisons. I interviewed 36 such volunteers. They were a mix of people in the local communities I volunteered in, and others were from other parts of the country. And here I'll just very quickly show you the table that demonstrates the kind of demographic information of the different volunteers I interviewed. And of course, you can see that overwhelmingly, right, they are Caucasian and female. So here too, I found, right, two kinds of narratives. There was a predominant narrative, which was, why teach yoga or meditation in prison? And the predominant narrative was to make prisoners better and to reduce crime, right? This idea that incarcerated persons can improve themselves through better choices and more personal responsibility. And this idea that social and political change requires inner change by individuals. This was very much the predominant view, right? People who go to prison, they're bad people, they need to become better human beings, and somebody needs to teach them and show them the path, right? And this idea that they need to learn self-control, they need to learn impulse control, they need to have the opportunity for personal transformation. They need to stay out of trouble, they need to become more accountable to themselves, they need to reflect on their habits and behavior, they need to be less impulsive, and they won't go back to jail if they're taking responsibility for their lives. And I saw a tremendous amount of stereotyping, trafficking in stereotypes by these volunteers. And these are some direct quotes, I promise you, I'm not making this up. Yoga is a marvelous way of taking a broken, undisciplined individual and giving them some guidance. Some of them are like puppies at the pound. We want to go in and socialize them, right? So lots and lots of stereotyping, sweeping generalizations about people who need instruction about living in society, right? My other favorite, actually, no, I don't think I have that quote on here. We'll get to it later. So of course, there's a dissenting narrative here as well, right? Adina, one of my interviewees, says, yoga is a form of self-regulation, not so that we can be okay with things that are wrong, but so that we can develop strategies for liberation in a more effective and sustainable way. If we have just stopped with tolerating discomfort, we become a tool for keeping people down, right? And they talk about how yoga can be utilized as a political vehicle, something that could stir the pot, that could engage more feelings of rights and awareness, right? And this group of volunteers really rejected the standardized narratives of people needing rehabilitation. And Morgan says, I'm not sure that they needed rehabilitation as much as they needed support. The things that got you in there, like prostitution and drug use, were not things that you had control over. And Kesha said, if you're not really addressing the deeper cause, you're only putting in place another form of oppression. It may be a nice oppression, but it's still oppression. And this is actually one of my favorite quotes from Jackson, who says, the idea that you can make a slave on a plantation happier, but he's still a slave. We're just teaching them how to deal with their anxiety or their anger. So they're feeling better and they're less likely to come back to prison because they've been able to deal with their stress, but they haven't necessarily been able to understand and respond to the collective cause of what's going on. So the slave doesn't necessarily want to ask tough questions about slavery to a point of revolt. And of course, there was much critique of the kind of yoga, North American yoga culture, which one interviewee said is largely uninformed about social and political issues and not deeply interested in them, right? Social and political education are not part of mainstream yoga training, and we have a tendency to think of yoga as something apolitical. People talked about yoga being used as spiritual bypass, this idea of, oh, everything happens for a reason, and oh, that's just their karma to live this out, right? And so a kind of apolitical and anti-intellectual yoga culture with not a lot of critical thinking, just these fluffy ideas about the world where we don't have to confront ourselves too much. So I'm going to have to move a little bit faster so that I can wrap this up in a timely fashion. What we see here is that the volunteers who expressed the first narrative were those who repeatedly condemned the institutionalized racism of the prison system, but in the same breath spoke of incarcerated persons as though their actions were freely chosen outside of any structural constraints. And their focus was on people changing, right? Seeking to treat or reform or remake individuals, encouraging people to look within for the answers to their problems, rather than focusing on the deeply unequal conditions within which their choices were made. There was a pathologizing of these students as criminal and undisciplined and unevolved, even childlike, right? And it's interesting to contrast this with the second narrative in which people were rejecting the idea of addressing a systemic political problem just through making individuals better. Simply making individuals better does not equal social justice, right? Now, to be clear, these volunteers were not opposed to teaching incarcerated individuals greater self-regulation and awareness and discipline. I want to be very clear about that. Rather, self-discipline for incarcerated people had to be combined with the political goals of challenging the inequity and injustice of the system. Incarcerated people could be encouraged to become subversive, to be less submissive, less accepting of the prison's authority, at least in their outlook, if not in their actions, right? And one person says, any self-management teachings that don't include an understanding of systemic inequities runs the risk of colluding with the prison system, reaffirming that logic that people are only in prison because they have made bad choices. The last thing I want to just reference very quickly, and I don't think I have time to talk about it at length, but I'm certainly happy to say more about it later, is the collaboration and co-authorship that I undertook with two of my incarcerated students. And this really emerged from a yogic philosophy study group inside one of the prisons I was volunteering in. And I kind of developed a relationship with these women, and through that relationship, we undertook forms of, dialogue and collaboration and co-authorship. And we produced a collaborative piece of writing in which they discussed the truly transformative potentials of yoga and meditation practice. I don't have time to go through all of the quotes from this particular chapter, but I just want to highlight the very last one. And this is a quote from one of my co-authors who says, "There is a difference between simply using yoga and meditation to relax, to become passive, to just feel better about your situation, and using it to meet challenge in a constructive way." I remember one of the yoga teachers giving us instructions about holding warrior 2 one day, and she talked about recognizing your discomfort, but then using that discomfort to meet challenge by developing your own knowledge. We're not just using yoga or mindfulness to accept the discomfort, but to take that and to have clear vision, more defined vision, to see things for what they are and to meet the challenges head on. So how do I want to wrap this up now that I see that we have really reached the end of our time together? I want to talk about what is at stake in this book. I think that what is at stake in the book is examining the promises and pitfalls of yoga and meditation when taught and received in prisons in these different ways. This book presents a contrast between two models of yoga or meditation in prisons, while also offering the caveat that this clean division does not explain everything, right? One model is based on solely individual improvement, combined with acceptance and coping, and the other is a more capacious self-improvement that fosters critique of the standard narratives that perpetuate unjust systems. And these two models could encourage very different stances or ways of being in the world, right? The first one can give disadvantaged people the message that they must deal with their own discomfort and transcend their circumstances, adjust and accept them. But the second model also focuses on self-improvement, but in so doing, it seeks to transform people's understanding of the systemic factors that constrain or shape their lives. And as a result, it can have a kind of emancipatory effect on individual and group consciousness. But I also want to caution against an either-or lens. The powerful and complicated narratives I share here reveal that regardless of which posture they promote toward the prison system, yoga or meditation may be a way of strengthening oneself to find freedom within and despite the brutal constraints of a dehumanizing system, to become internally free despite being outwardly confined, whether or not this is considered rebellion by those who teach or practice it. I think the binary framework that I've offered here was very useful in understanding these two narratives, which often overlap with each other. But at the same time, this binary did not fully capture the complexity of what I found, which is that across the board, these practices of self-control and self-discipline could help people develop an internal strength and a sense of freedom that defied the institution's capacity to define their lived experience. It allowed them to feel more humanized and more liberated and more free in the face of an institution that was intent on eliminating their agency and their autonomy. It gave them tools to survive the continuous psychic and physical assault on their beings. And this is why I end by quoting one of my interviewees who says that in the face of routine institutionalized violence, her yoga practice opened her eyes to what she calls the superhero inside me. And that's ultimately why the title of the book is Freedom Inside. So let me just stop there now. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Farah. That was fantastic. A lot to reflect on, I think, and to speak a little bit to your kind of the final part of your talk first. I've been aware for a while of kind of an evolving struggle with some yoga teacher training programs to try and answer some of these questions as well. How do we teach for actual social justice and liberation? And it's really interesting to see what programs are kind of doing to try and fill those gaps, I think, because, you know, there's a real missing toolkit for many yoga teachers here in how the things they need to go into these environments. I love the idea of the co-authorship. I'd love you to speak more about that. But I'm going to use my host privilege first and just ask a couple of questions. That I actually wrote it down. That one of the first things you put up was that thing about your line about prisons as places where inequality and subordination are taught, learned, and reproduced. And I think that's a very important line. And I'm wondering whether you have had any chance to connect this to experiences of yoga in educational settings, which can feel like a different kind of carceral institution and a different form of indoctrination. So I wondered if you'd had any chance to kind of make those connections yet.
Yeah, can you say more about what you mean by yoga in educational settings? I'm curious.
I mean yoga. I mean kind of yoga in schools in particular, and in other kind of educational settings where yoga is being used as a way, as you said, to kind of keep students calm and make them kind of fit for learning within school systems, which are also quite oppressive in different ways, I guess.
Yeah. So I have not actually done much work with yoga in educational settings. I teach a course on the yogic and meditative traditions of South Asia to undergraduate and graduate students here at UC Riverside. And in that course, I'm very mindful about kind of putting all of this on the table and kind of getting students to engage and critique and problematize these kind of, you know, oppressive disciplinary aspects of these traditions. But I have to say that my experience is primarily in the studio environment and in the prison environment. Those are the two sets of experiences that I have come at this project from. So I'd be very curious to know more from those of you, perhaps, who are doing work in the kind of pre-college school setting. And I've certainly read the research, right? I've certainly read research by people like, I think there's someone named Daniel Simpson, actually, who does some of this research in the UK. I've certainly read the research by people who talk about, right, the way in which these practices are taught to students from largely disadvantaged, right, backgrounds, who come from largely Black or brown communities, where they're basically being told that there's something wrong with them. They're acting out. They're undisciplined. They're unruly. They're disruptive. They're unmanageable, right? And they're being told that there's something wrong with them, without anyone being able to sort of critically interrogate why it is that these behaviors might be correlated with the forms of trauma and abuse and systemic disadvantage that a lot of these students are coping with, and the kind of backgrounds that they come from. So I have to say that I have no kind of personal investment in or experience with that particular context, but I'm certainly curious to hear more from those of you who may perhaps have been involved in those contexts, and to perhaps make some more of those connections. So I really appreciate the question, and would love to hear more if you have thoughts on that.
Definitely, because I think the thematic links are really clear. I guess my other question to you is, one of the things I was wondering is, so much of this, I think you really bring this in some ways away from the practices and into the philosophies and almost the theologies of these situations, of what it means to be a practitioner. What is it that we're searching for as practitioners? And I wondered, therefore, for you, I guess, who are the kind of the liberation theologists of yoga in that sense? Because for me, I'm immediately thinking of Thich Nhat Hanh, I'm thinking of bell hooks, more on the Buddhist side and so on. Where do we go to for those people, I guess?
That's a great question, and I do spend some time talking about that. The bulk of the book is, my own work in prison, interviews, ethnographies, collaborations, personal narrative, but there is a chapter where I do actually address the question of the liberation theology. My liberation theologist of choice is Gandhi, but not in an unproblematic way. I want to be very clear about that, right? And anybody who has been a student of Gandhi knows that there are some pretty troubling forms of, let's call it, patriarchy and casteism, and even to push it further, a little bit of misogyny and kind of gender-based, some really troubling gender-based discrimination. But with all of that said, I think, all of these figures are complex, right? These figures are all very complicated. They are not one thing or another. And in the case of Gandhi, I think that there's a lot of emancipatory, liberatory approach to yoga and meditation that can be extrapolated from his writing and thinking. And the piece of Gandhi that I find the most liberatory is his contention that, these practices are tools for us to not only become aware of injustice, but to call it out, to disrupt the everyday working of social, political, economic systems, and to do so in a really actually kind of aggressive way. And there's a way to be aggressive but non-violent, right? Confrontational, disruptive, aggressive, yet non-violent. And it doesn't always have to be through action. It can also be through political consciousness, right? It's through words, it's through understanding as much as through action. So we can certainly talk a lot more about Gandhi, but yes, Bell Hooks is another person who I cite. There are contemporary scholars and practitioners who I'm very impressed by. Some of the people I draw inspiration from are Rhonda McGee, who has a book on race and mindfulness. There's also Tara Brach of the. I'm more interested in institutions than in people necessarily. Of course, Thich Nhat Hanh is very much, very, very inspirational. Although I actually think Thich Nhat Hanh's work, the more we read it, is less kind of openly disruptive toward injustice than Gandhi's, but that's a different conversation. So in addition to Bell Hooks, there's Rhonda McGee, there's Tara Brach of the Insight Meditation Center of Washington, and there's also the East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland, which I highly recommend. Which Mushim Patricia Ikeda is somebody who runs that center. So I have actually, if we read, some of you may know Anne Glide's work, and she's written a book called American Dharma. And in that book, I really take my cues from her, where she talks not just about people, but institutions and organizations that are engaging in what you have so, I think, aptly termed liberation theology. And another great one is Off the Mat into the World. And that's run by Hela Khoury, who I consider, kind of a friend and inspiration. So, these are all people. I think liberation theologists come in all shapes and sizes, right? There are people like the Gandhis and the Thich Nhat Hanhs. And by the way, another person is Sulak Sivaraksa, who's a Thai Buddhist monk. So you've got that whole generation of South and Southeast Asian, right, sort of monk-like figures. But we don't need to only hew to that kind of ascetic, right, that very kind of ascetic classical example that is set by those exemplars. We have some pretty awesome modern liberation theologists operating, here in the US. And I would love to hear more about, those of you who have encountered some people in the UK and Europe. I'd love to know more about those voices.
Yeah, definitely. Lots of good connections, and lots, not all, but lots of names I already know, and some of which I count as friends too. So it's interesting. You're right, kind of those connections are important as well. I'm going to open things up to the Slido because the questions are coming in. I think up the top actually is our own Erica. Are you the first question? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's me. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful and rich talk. I'm curious what yoga and meditation actually mean in the context of your ethnographic work. What was being taught? Was it a particular style, lineage, brand? What was emphasized or not? I'm particularly curious about, was it asana, was it breath, was it rest and relaxation? And how might that have impacted your findings?
Great question. Thanks, Erica. The short answer is that it was no one thing. And it depended very much, not just on the context, but on the organization and the people running the organizations. And this goes back to, right, some of the distinctions I made between the different kinds of organizations and the different, kind of views that they were kind of carrying with them or inspired by. I would say for the most part, here in the US at least, and certainly in US prisons, yoga was mostly associated with asana, right? And it really wasn't until a student wanted to go deeper that they started to come to us and ask us about texts that they could read. And then they sort of said, oh, I didn't realize that yoga was about so much more than posture, right? And so it was very important, I think, in our work. And it's important for me to note that I volunteered with very different organizations and very different kinds of organizations. And I would say the extent to which non-postural or non-physical aspects of these traditions were incorporated depended to a great extent on the commitments of the specific organizations, if that makes any sense. And what I found was a great deal of variety and multiplicity and polyvocality, as you might imagine, in just the same way that, right, we see that yoga in the US, certainly, and in the West, is no one thing, right? It's a creature of construction, it's a creature of fabrication, it's a creature of invention. And in that same way, I found that within different, settings and sub-settings, even within prisons, these traditions were being continually constructed and invented and reinvented and fabricated, right, in all kinds of ways that, had to do with the commitments of the people teaching them, but also very often, and this is important to note, that incarcerated students were not passive recipients, right? This is very important to note. And this is why my collaboration with my incarcerated students was, such an eye-opener and such a joy, because these were students who said, wait a minute, I want to take a very active role in reinterpreting these traditions for myself, right? And those were students who really found themselves doing a deep dive into kind of the philosophical underpinnings, into, right, asana plus breath, plus dhyana, plus samadhi, plus, right, all the different, I had students who were serious readers of the Yoga Sutras, who wanted to go like line by line, right, and kind of really deconstruct all the different, kind of teachings in the Yoga Sutras. So, I mean, the short answer is that in the context of the prison, yoga and meditation mean many different things to many different people. There's also a conversation to be had about trauma-informed yoga, which I found was, in fact, in the organizations I volunteered with, there was a great deal of resistance to trauma-informed yoga. There's also a conversation to be had about the fetishizing of the purity and authenticity of yoga by certain kinds of organizations, which were much more interested in preserving, right, the transmission of a kind of unbroken lineage, which, I find, to be kind of absurd, because in my own research, I've talked about how yoga has never been any one thing, right? So I found organizations that were much more interested in fetishizing purity. And then I found organizations that said, that is absolutely not what we are here for. We are not here to fetishize, these traditions as pure or authentic in any way. So, the short answer is that it was very polyvocal, and, very different things were being emphasized depending on who was teaching and who was learning.
Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to go to Jennifer Musial, if you're there. Hi, Jennifer. How are you doing?
Hello. Thank you for taking my question. Thank you for sharing your a preview of this book that's coming out. I'm really excited to read it and dive in. As someone who has both taught in carceral facilities and done some scholarship on prison yoga, I'm just so excited about this book. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about your own personal experience and the paradox of navigating both being a critic of the systems and also a participant as a volunteer teacher at the same time.
Gosh, thank you, Jennifer. Such a great question and so much to be said. I actually gave an entire talk on just that aspect, like a whole hour-long talk on just that. So I'm going to try and distill some of that, reduce it and boil it down as much as I can in a very brief, brief response. But the short answer is to say that, paradox is the right word, right? Paradox, tension, contradiction, these are all the right ways to describe what I was trying to do. I was trying to navigate some pretty tricky territory, right? So like the first thing I learned was I could not do this work only as a scholar. The avenues open to me as a quote unquote researcher were severely limited, right? Because prisons, as I'm sure you know, and so many people who have worked in these environments know, prisons are not interested in transparency and accountability and oversight. And so they're really not interested in allowing researchers inside in a kind of official capacity to see what's going on in there. So I learned very quickly that being just a researcher was not going to cut it. It was going to give me an extremely limited and constrained view, and a view that was going to be very much shaped by the prison and its rules and regulations. So very quickly, I started to see that I had to move into a kind of different positionality. I had to become a volunteer and enter the context as a volunteer, right? And the kinds of things I was able to learn as a volunteer they would have been impossible for me to learn as researcher alone, because the kind of access I was given as a researcher was so severely restricted and produced such a different kind of understanding and narrative. And the world that opened up to me once I went in as a volunteer was an entirely other world in which I was able to immerse myself. And the key, I think the thing I want to emphasize the most, because I can't talk about this as fully as I would like to right now, the thing I want to emphasize is that in my role as a volunteer, I was able to engage with my incarcerated students through relations of equity and reciprocity in a way that I was not as researcher. Because as researcher, I was bound by the very hierarchical rules of the mission of custody and control that the prison insists that you abide by. So I had to treat the incarcerated people I encountered as research subjects, as people who were not capable of creating knowledge, as people whose thinking was not capable of disciplining my thinking, right? I had to treat them in a much more traditional subject way. When I entered as a volunteer, I was able to subvert all of those relations. I was able to engage with my incarcerated students, not only as equals, but as people who could discipline my thinking, as people who could create knowledge, as people who could lead, right? Lead my thinking in certain directions. And that was actually the most sort of challenging and difficult thing, was navigating those two different roles, because the truth of the matter, Jennifer, as you know, is those roles are fuzzy. The boundaries between those roles are very fuzzy. You are never entirely one thing or another, right? And the key for me was ethically always remaining transparent with the people I was working with and making sure that they always understood what I was up to, right? And my biggest sort of struggle, I would say, my biggest ethical struggle was ensuring that I treated my incarcerated participants ethically and fairly and appropriately. And for me, that meant always being very transparent with them about what I was up to, but I didn't feel the same obligation, to be very frank, with the prison system. I did not feel an obligation to always be transparent with them about what I was doing. And I'll just be, very honest and upfront about that. But that means that there's a lot of very tricky navigation, as you say, to be undertaken. I didn't go asking prisons for permission to do research inside prisons while also informing them of my critical view, right? Like I wasn't putting that into the research proposal that I was sharing with the prisons. So, that is all by way of saying one has to navigate some very tricky terrain when attempting to gain access. And to me, the key is always keeping in mind the interests and needs of my incarcerated and formerly incarcerated participants. I felt that as long as I kept their needs and concerns and preoccupations front and center, I felt like I was able to navigate this with a little bit more skill, if that makes any sense. But thank you for that question.
And it's such a great example of participatory research. Like this is, these are all the struggles that we go through, right, to do this work well. Thank you. We have a few anonymous questions as well, so I'm going to read one out here that's asking whether the two narratives that you kind of that you found amongst the prisoners essentially correlated to the views and experiences of the volunteers. So you have these two narratives of the volunteers and these two narratives of this the incarcerated population. Do they correlate in practice?
The short answer I would say is yes, but let's be cognizant of the fact that these two narratives are not exhaustive, right? They're first of all not exhaustive, and second of all, they are mutually implicated. They're not mutually what's the word? Like they mutually reinforce and implicate one another. So yes, I mean, I would say the two narratives serve as a kind of framework for me to hang kind of the findings of the entire book. But these things are always shorthands, right? We always use a kind of shorthand for something, but of course, keeping in mind that shorthand is exactly that, right? It's like an easy way for us to talk about big ideas, but we also know that the shorthand does not capture everything. So I would say, in short, I would say yes. Among both the volunteers and among the formerly incarcerated interviewees, I found that the narratives did largely correlate, right? We had we always had a predominant narrative. The predominant narrative was always, this idea of people have to learn individual responsibility. Everything is the fault of the individual, and we're here to optimize, improve, reform, right, the self of the incarcerated person. And I did find that among both incarcerated and incarcerated practitioners and volunteers, that narrative had a certain kind of currency. I will say, though, that the forms of stereotyping I saw among volunteers was really quite remarkable and unique. This is something that really stood out to me that I, of course, did not see among the formerly incarcerated interviewees. I mean, the extent to which volunteers really thought that they were saving or helping a population that was, truly flawed, pathological, childlike, irresponsible. I mean, that to me was kind of the major distinction between the interviews with volunteers and the interviews with formerly incarcerated people. And it was really striking to me. I mean, you saw that one quote I read out about like puppies at the
puppies
pound,
in the pound.
right? Yeah, exactly. So
wow.
So that was a really striking difference. But so and then again, in the dissenting narrative, I think the dissenting narrative was actually quite convergent among the formerly incarcerated interviewees and the fellow volunteers, right? There was a lot of kind of convergence there. So but I want to say that while I did find this convergence and while I find these two narratives sort of convenient, I also want to caution against, right, that either or lens. I want to caution against only seeing this in terms of the binary. And I want to talk about sort of the rich terrain that lies at the intersection of these narratives, right? The rich terrain in which it's not just about individual responsibility or political consciousness, but it's about this kind of capacious, robust form of self-improvement in which people are concerned. Because look, this is something I feel that I have to repeat and say again and again, because no matter how many times I say it, I always find somebody who doesn't get it. This is not a book that is arguing against teaching self-improvement or self-regulation, right?
Absolutely.
I feel the need to really say that because people are always like, well, what do you mean? Shouldn't people improve themselves? Well, of course, everyone can benefit from self-improvement. And in fact, it's deeply condescending and patronizing to assume that, disadvantaged people cannot also engage in the same forms of self-regulation and self-optimization that, the rest of us are undertaking, right? So that is not at all the point of these narratives. I mean, the point is to think about a more capacious and robust way in which we can both, think about self-improvement, but not have it hang on this insistence on denying the existence of structural inequity, right? And that's the piece. Those are the two pieces that I want us to see working in conjunction. That we don't want to be thinking about a system in which, release or moving on with one's life is predicated on the ability to parrot a kind of party line narrative in which we have to deny the existence of systemic or structural oppression, if that makes any sense. So anyway, I hope that was helpful.
Important and yes, and a vital clarification, I think. Not to allow people to confuse those things. We have a number of questions in the Slido, but as we don't have a lot of time, and a lot of them kind of touch on things you've already touched on already. I'm going to go to Jeff, actually, who's someone who's asked a question that no one's asking, so I think that's a good one. Can you unmute yourself, Jeff?
Oh, you can read it. That's fine.
You want me to read it? I can do that. Okay.
I'm not looking at the Slido, so I don't remember exactly how I phrased it.
Okay, don't worry. I'll ask it for you then. Don't worry. So what he's asking is whether yoga and meditation teachers in these environments are encountering any opposition from evangelical or other conservative Christian chaplains, and essentially how those kind of different kinds of self-improvement forces are playing out together. I think it's an important question.
Such a great question, Jeff, and I'm so glad you asked it. I actually do talk about this extensively in one chapter of the book. There is a huge I don't know what to call it, kind of a divide of antagonism and hostility in prisons between those who teach yoga and meditation and the kind of, the sort of Christian religious programs. We encountered that regularly. We had our students, yoga students, meditation students, tell us that when they tried to attend Christian programs, they were told by the Christian chaplains, you can't come to us if you're doing yoga or meditation. Yoga and meditation are the work of the devil. Some of them quote those chaplains saying. We also heard from prison officials and administrators and officers that they were under pressure from the Christian chaplains to make sure that nobody in the yoga and meditation classes was being proselytized or converted. Kind of rich, if you ask me, right? So it was very clear to us, and I spend, some time in one chapter of the book, kind of trying to unpack this a little bit. It's hard to unpack because much of what I encountered, came sort of secondhand via students, via fellow volunteers, via very quick conversations with prison administrators. So, it's kind of pieced together piecemeal from all of these different sources, but it's very clear that there is strong opposition inside prisons from more traditionally, let's say, Judeo-Christian, right, Abrahamic faiths inside prisons. And I think part of the reason for that is competition for resources and time and energy inside prisons is stiff, right? One of the things that all volunteer programs are competing for is time and space. And I'm actually facing this right now. I'm trying to restart a yoga program that got shut down by the pandemic. They all got shut down by the pandemic. And now, of course, we're trying to get back in. And what's the first thing that administrators are saying to us? Oh, well, we don't know if we can give you that same time slot back because, now people have church and they have, right? Like all of those religious programs get priority, right? And I think part of the reason is because for many, many years until quite recently, those programs were the only things available to incarcerated people in the US. And it actually took a lawsuit. I didn't even know this myself. It took a lawsuit for non-Abrahamic faiths like Buddhism and Native American religions to be allowed to have chaplaincy inside prisons. There was actually a lawsuit by an incarcerated person who said, we need to have access to religious programming besides, right, Christianity and Judaism. So for a long time, I think those programs, had a kind of stronghold, right, on rehabilitation inside prisons. And then along came yoga and along came Buddhism. And you can imagine all the ways in which the kind of Judeo-Christian Abrahamic metaphysics are threatened, right, by the metaphysics of the kind of yogic and meditative traditions. Those are two very different sets of metaphysical views, right? And so that competition for time and resources and space is very much alive inside prisons. There are many times when we would show up to teach yoga and the officer would sort of apologetically say, I'm so sorry, we had to give your time slot to the Christian group. Sorry, no yoga today. Turn around and drive back 1 hour. Sorry, good luck. Next time we'll try, So this competition was very alive. The hostility was very alive, and it's something we had to think very carefully about how we navigated again that terrain. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Great question. There's one more. I think Paul had, if you're okay, with one more. I know we're going a little bit over time. If you're okay,
I'm happy to hang out. Yeah, we can hang out for a few more minutes.
Can I find Paul has already gone? As long as I can keep.
I saw Paul here.
I think he might had to pop off because we are a few minutes over time, but I can give you his question anyway.
Sure.
If I can keep a lid on the greyhound for a few minutes longer. He's asking, can you talk about the interactions you observed between prisoners? Did you say ways in which they encourage one another to adopt one narrative or other? It's a really good question.
Such a great question. Again, I wish we had, hours to talk about this.
Sure.
But I think for the most part, it seemed as though the kind of predominant narrative was the one that I saw circulating the most between them. And it actually made me kind of uncomfortable. There were times when I had to really keep a lid on myself to not sort of like interject too much, because I didn't want to be very interventionist in my work with incarcerated people. I really wanted them to take the lead, and I wanted to just be a kind of a more of a silent observer without interjecting too much. Although, of course, over time, as I developed relationships of trust and rapport, that changed. But certainly initially, I actually found myself very uncomfortable by so many of the ways in which I saw the kind of predominant narrative of individual responsibility circulating inside the prison via the encouragement of incarcerated people themselves, who would sort of, stand up and sort of give their testimony and say, oh, I'm so glad I found yoga and meditation. Now I can improve myself. Now I can take more responsibility. Now I can become a better person. And sort of everybody else nodding along. And there were times when I had to really kind of muzzle myself and say, but wait, wait, can we talk about structural stuff, right? So I certainly saw that happening. And it's definitely a very important phenomenon. But I also saw, this was much more rare, this was not as common, I also saw moments of solidarity and political consciousness and awareness building. Those were much more rare. Those were happening in ways that I would say were much more, of course, under the radar. They had to be, right? Because prisons don't like any expression of political awareness or consciousness. They clamp down on it very quickly. But it was happening, and I, was able to kind of seed a little bit of that on my own as well. But it was definitely not the predominant way in which I saw incarcerated people interacting with one another. It's important to note that my access to seeing incarcerated people interact with one another was also very limited, right? And this is something I say in the book. It's not really fair to call my time in prison immersive, because I only got a certain slice of prison life.
Yes.
I was able to arrive at a certain time, do, one class, maybe hang out a little bit after class, but really that was it. I was not privy to what happened in housing units. I was not privy to what happened in dining areas. I was not privy to what happened in recreational time, right? Because our entrance and exit was very prescribed. We couldn't just hang out indefinitely. And so what I was seeing was a very specific slice of life. And I have often wondered, and I wish Paul were here for me to talk this through with him. By the way, Paul is a good friend of mine. I have often wondered whether people were performing for our benefit.
Yeah.
I have often wondered about that, because I have often thought that volunteers can be seen as an extension of the prison administration.
Yes.
They don't know that we're subversive. And in fact, a lot of volunteers are not subversive. So it occurs to me that very often what I might have seen among incarcerated people was a kind of performance of personal responsibility, because that's what they think we want to see. Right? So anyway.
Fascinating questions. There's always something you can't see, right, in research. That's the problem. I'm aware that there's a few, I won't go through them, but there's a few comments on the Slido by people who do have connection with different forms of kind of similar practice here in the UK in particular. If I don't, just in case I forget, I would love to put you in contact specifically with Edinburgh Community Yoga. Like Edinburgh Community Yoga, I think you'd have really interesting conversations with. They've been doing work in prisons for a long time, and they're asking themselves all the same questions about that we've been talking about today. So that would be really lovely. But I'm aware of the time, and I know how tiring it gets with these kinds of things. So I'm not going to ask you any more questions, but thank you so much for the talk. I'm really looking forward to the book. When does it come out, by the way? Do you have a date on that? Do you know?
So I'm told that it's supposed to be released in mid-May, so not long now. But I'm also told that Oxford University Press, like so many other institutions, is facing a supply chain issues.
Yeah.
So it's unclear whether the immediate release will be electronic only, and the hard copy might take a little bit longer because of print issues. But I will happily let you know when the electronic release happens.
Do let us know, and we'll put it out on our channels and let people know, because I'm sure people will be interested in that. We can definitely do that. So I just want to take one moment just to let people know what's coming up next.